Hello, my name is Maxwell Thomas White, and today we will be discussing the principle of effective demand in the 21st century. The thesis that I have proposed is that due to firm behavior during the COVID-19 global pandemic, new data shows that firms behave in accordance with Keynes's model of the principle of effective demand, but there are still issues with a 21st century application, which I pose as questions for an adapted model. I also conclude that the principle of effective demand is a purely explanatory model and not a moral model in accord with Keynes's economic philosophy. We will first begin with an analysis of Keynes's economic philosophy to understand his model of employment, the principle of effective demand. And it's first important to note that Keynes posits that there are three stages of history. The first is the era of scarcity, the second is the era of abundance, and the third is the era of stability. The era of abundance is characterized by that industrial revolution of the 17th and 18th century, which brought material goods into production at scales which had never been seen before in human history. The era of stability was noted as coming into fruition around the beginning of the 20th century. Keynes also notes that economic solutions arise in the era of stability, such as fascism and Bolshevism. However, neither of these for Keynes are stable economic solutions. During this time period, Keynes also refutes the idea that socialism will be a stable economic solution because socialism is built upon the same principles as laissez-faire capitalism, that is, market system where prices dictate the allocations of scarce goods and resources. However, what's driving the stages of history, Keynes notes, is the economic problem, that is, the struggle for subsistence. And Keynes notes that the economic problem is not the permanent problem of the human race, because we've been expressly evolved by nature, with all of our impulses and deepest instincts, for the purpose of solving the economic problem. And if the economic problem is solved, mankind will be deprived of its traditional purpose. Thus, for the first time since his creation, man will be faced with his permanent problem: how to use his freedom from pressing economic cares, how to occupy the leisure which science and compound interest will have won for him, to live wisely and agreeably and well. Keynes also notes that we have a political problem that society needs to address, and it will be achieved, or rather the political problem will be solved by combining first economic efficiency, social justice, and individual liberty. However, Keynes also notes that there are many economic vices as well as their antithetical virtues at stake. Keynes notes that the greatest evils of our time are the fruits of risk, uncertainty, and ignorance, all of which play a massive role in the general theory of employment, interest rates, and money. However, Keynes also notes that abuse and manipulation of these, the fruits of risk, uncertainty, and ignorance, cause inequality and unemployment. Keynes also notes that avarice is a vice, the extraction of usury is a misdemeanor, and the love of money is detestable. I see us free, therefore, to return to some of the most sure and certain principles of religious traditional virtue. Moving on to the principle of effective demand, it's important to understand that for Keynes, this was a model that not only sought to understand employment, but to seek the causes of unemployment. That's why, as Keynes noted, it is an explanation of the paradox of poverty in the midst of plenty. Now, Keynes lays out 8 different principles which sum up the basic assumptions or axioms of the model, and however, I've chose to condense these into 3 for the sake of general understanding and also time. Now, the first is that income depends on employment. The second, a community's propensity to consume, that is, their tendency to spend the money that they make from their income, is dependent on their aggregate income. As income rises, so does spending, but never above income. That is the basic psychological law that Keynes posits as part of the propensity to consume. For the third, I could not say it better than Keynes. Hence, the volume of employment in equilibrium depends on the aggregate supply function, the propensity to consume, and the volume of employment, and the volume of investment. This is the essence of the general theory of employment. Now, moving on to what the principle of effective demand actually looks like and how we can understand it, we first need to define our terms. So first off, the linear line D is equal, it's a sum, so it is equal to private investment, both in wages and capital, and consumer spending. Z is equal to the aggregate supply price, or in other words, the amount of revenue needed to entice employment, and N is equal to employment. Now it's important to note that where D, so that private investment plus consumer spending, is equal to the aggregate supply price, or Z, that is the point of effective demand, which Keynes refers to. However, there are many times when the two do not align. So for example, at the point of N1, where D is greater than Z, profits rise and production expands. However, on the point where there is N2, where Z is greater than D, we see that profits fall and productions decline. I would also like to note that this graph here is borrowed from Dr. John Watkins, a professor of economics at Westminster College. And if anything good can come out of the global COVID-19 pandemic, it can be for economists. It's not called the dismal science for no reason. However, new data is showing that firms are operating under the same basic model of the principle of effective demand in the 21st century. As early as March 11th, California tourism-based firms were reacting to a reduction in consumer spending, those consumers who were choosing not to book hotel rooms, go on cruises, anything of that kind of like. Firms that were actively engaged in that form of revenue reduced their investment almost immediately, specifically their investment in employment as early as March 11th. And this is a quintessential moment where D, specifically the consumer spending function, was lower than the aggregate supply price. And it was made worse in terms of employment when there was the corresponding reduction in private investment. And I chose this particular set of data precisely because it corresponds prior to any form of government-mandated lockdown or stay-at-home orders. This was an issue of voluntary firm behavior that was not instigated by government, which the distinction between the voluntary firm behavior versus the forced lockdowns or self-isolation or any other quarantine measures taken or enacted make it hard to differentiate the data between what can correspond to this model and what is the instance of a crisis that doesn't quite fit this type of economic model. However, we also see for March that there are incredibly high unemployment rates. And specifically, I want to draw attention to two tweets from Betsy Stevenson and Seth D. Harris. Betsy Stevenson was the former member of the President's Council of Economic Advisors and chief economist at Labor. She's a current academic economist at Michigan. And Seth D. Harris was the former acting secretary and department secretary of Labor. Both of them have asserted that our unemployment rate is probably closer to 20% after 1 month of these type of measures, which is an incredibly high unemployment rate, something we haven't seen in modern history. And more research can be done in terms of understanding whether or not the majority of this is easily explained by the principle of effective demand, but the initial measures absolutely can be measured in that sort of language and terminology. I also quickly want to go over some issues with the modern application of the principle of effective demand. I've phrased these problems as 4 questions, the first being how consumer credit affects the propensity to consume when an individual or a community is borrowing their potential future income, especially if they are unable to pay back the loan. Essentially, that's what consumer credit is. Second question is, how does an employer's indifference curve with cost-oriented trade-offs affect employment regardless of a firm's expected profit? That is the aggregate supply price. Are wealthy individuals and communities savers, as Keynes asserted, or are they spenders? One way of thinking about this is through Veblen's invidious distinction and economic waste, also conspicuous consumption. And the fourth question, with a little bit of lead up, I have extrapolated that the principle of effective demand assumes an aggregate economy where employees are at will, where you can easily fire and hire. How does state policy enforcing contracts affect that model? And can you even aggregate a mixed employee contract economy? And I believe these questions are essential towards refining this model and making it applicable towards the United States in the 21st century. And here is my bibliography, and thank you all for listening and watching. And I want to thank Westminster, I want to thank John Watkins, I want to thank Sid Seidelman, and the other amazing faculty and staff there.